Hey guys, kind of a late night in the garage. I've been meaning to put together a video on shocks, on rear shocks for the R50 Pathfinder. And normally we just go straight into the pen and paper of it. I'm going to my little infographic stuff, but this one needs a bit of an introduction. Let's talk about how I did some of this research, what I did. So I went on Rock Auto and I pulled OEM part numbers for both facelift and pre-facelift R50s. And then left alone the 99 model year because that's when the facelift happens. But what I can tell you is that a 2000 has the same shock mounts as an 04 and all the way in between, and that a 96 to a 98 has the same shock mounts. I am presuming that exactly at the moment that Nissan put a honeycomb grille and updated the face on the Pathfinder in 1999, I am presuming that that is when the shock mounts change. 96 to 99, axle mount, lower, it's level with the axle on the lower mount. And it's way rearward of the tire on the upper mount, on the driver's side. Then on the driver's side of a facelift, like my 2003, you have a mount that is well below the rear axle, noticeably below the rear axle. And then a mount that is more centered on the tire and the wheel well, almost directly above the lower mount. So a facelift sits almost vertical, and then a pre-facelift sits at an angle, would be the simplest way to describe that. I pulled OEM shock numbers, KYB, got the KYB Dimensions Catalog, which is not a fitment guide, but I used it to figure out information about the shocks. Found the mounting codes, found the extended collapse lengths, and then based the rest of my research off of those numbers. So when you look up any dimension guide on shocks, while it's going to tell you the extended length, the collapse length, the mounting code, and depending on the company, some of those are easier or harder to read. Gabriel, fairly easy to read. KYB, fairly easy to read, but you can run into problems. So I went through this with a guy on Facebook. We looked at some Gabriel numbers. I looked at some Gabriel numbers for him, and I said, hey, here's extended length, here's travel of the shock, here's collapse length, and here's the mounting codes. We've got 260 millimeters, you got to modify one of the mounts, let's see if it fits. He went along with it. He wanted longer shocks for as cheap as possible. That's how we ended up there. And we pulled this Gabriel part number for a Mazda B4000, I think, and it fit on paper. He modified the upper mount, put it on his truck, and sure enough, the wider body of the shock, you know how a shock has a wider body and the smaller body that goes in it, like the KYB OEM ones, the wider part of it was contacting the frame of the vehicle as the suspension traveled. And so be prepared for some surprises because something like that could very easily happen and you get a shock that rubs on the frame if you're not careful. That's why the Bilsteins, I think, are so popular, is because they're the smooth body with the boot on the end instead of the wider body. And that makes it so they don't contact the frame. I've never heard of anyone pulling a Bilstein, putting it on their Pathfinder. Those smooth body 5100s, not the 4600s, the 5100s, seem to always fit as long as you can figure out the mounting situation. So if you're looking for a cheap shock, I have a pro comp number later in the video. That's going to be the cheapest one that I know someone has already put on their Pathfinder. You'll see that on the paper here soon. I was supposed to have the video already up at the point that I'm filming this. I'm just going to put together a really quick official disclaimer about this video. When we're fitting aftermarket shocks to R50 Pathfinders, there's really not a bolt-on application. You're responsible for doing the research on these shocks and knowing that beyond stuff that people have already put on their vehicles, I can't guarantee results with different shock numbers or anything like that. Anytime you put a new, longer shock on your vehicle, you should consider how that's going to affect your suspension travel, whether or not you're going to be able to retain your coil springs at full droop. You're going to want to think about the compression length of the shock And whether your bump stops need to be extended, you're going to want to think about your center brake line. You have either one or two flexible center brake lines that attach on top of the rear diff and go up to the unibody. The valving of the shocks, you're going to want to be familiar with the process and the part numbers that you're using. And that's all I have to say on that. And we can go into the technical info now and at least see what we're dealing with. All right, it is pen and paper time. Facelift, OEM part number facelift KYB 343379 at about 9.5 inches of travel, 24.17 extended, 14.72 collapsed. Pre-facelift 9699, 343388, almost 9 inches of travel, 23.14 extended, 14.29 collapsed. So let's talk about these collapsed extended numbers. That tells you, as far as I understood it from KYB's mounting guide, center of the bushing to center of the bushing, fully extended, this is your measurement, fully collapsed, this is your measurement, okay? Now, what's important with these collapsed lengths, these 14.29, 14.72, that is where the shock can be compressed no further. What that means is the way that the suspension, the 5-link suspension, is set up on an R50 Pathfinder QX4, that means that, oh, by the way, this should cross-reference to corresponding QX4s of the same years. This should correspond to QX4s. Anyway, this means that before the shock reaches this length, the bump stops that are connected to the frame will be resting on the axle. None of these shocks that I'm going to mention today are designed, in fact, there are very, very few, if any, shocks that are designed to be the primary limiter of suspension up travel. Shocks are not bump stops. Bump stops are bump stops. And if you don't have bump stops, you're risking damaging your shocks, OEM or not. So what this means is if we're going to extend our shocks, we have to watch this number, because the bigger this number gets, at some point we reach it where the shock is going to bottom out. It's going to reach minimum compression length before our bump stop contacts the frame. Ideally, well, really the only way to set it up is so that your bump stops are contacting the axle, your frame bump stops are contacting the axle before you reach this number, OEM or otherwise. But anyway, let's talk about mounting codes. So for both part numbers, we get E2 mounting codes. That means an I-ring bushing with a metal sleeve. In other words, a metal loop or a rubber loop bushing with a metal sleeve for both the upper and lower. Again, I read into KYB mounting codes. For a facelift, an upper mount is 12 millimeters inner diameter of the metal sleeve. Lower mount, 16 millimeter inner diameter metal sleeve, okay? But then on a pre-facelift, that's actually swapped. So the upper mount, based on these mounting codes, is 16 millimeters on the upper mount and 12 millimeters on the lower mount, which means that a facelift shock would fit exactly upside down on a pre-facelift and vice versa. In other words, they're not the same. Not only are they different shock mounts in terms of where they're located, but they're also exactly opposite widths. They have flip-flopped. Let's talk about aftermarket part numbers that people are using. We can start with this random one that I found on Facebook and can't vouch for it all. KYB 54332. On paper, 28-inch extended, 17-inch collapsed, with a 5/8 inch bushing, which is 15.8 millimeters, no metal sleeve, and an E2 12 millimeter lower mount sleeve. So that would technically, since the lower mount is the 12 millimeter and the upper one is a 60 millimeter, on paper it seems like that would fit on a pre-facelift. But like I mentioned before, since this is a KYB OEM one with the wider body, I have no idea if this would contact the axle or frame or not. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know that it works on paper, and I've not gotten in contact with anyone who runs that part number. So I'm not gonna guarantee it at all, because all I know is what it looks like on paper. Again, this is a bring your own research when we're talking about bump stops. Obviously, if you go from a 14.29 to a 14.3 shock, like, it's not all of a sudden gonna blow up your shock because you put in a slightly longer collapsed shock. But at some point, somewhere probably between 15 and 17 inches is when you're going to want to extend that bump stop. If you actually, when you're installing your shocks, if you actually take out the springs and compress your suspension and then measure the distance, you could actually figure out exactly where that is. I didn't do that when I was installing my shocks, so I don't have that math, and I didn't find it in any of my research. The bump stop math is speculation. Bring your own research. Don't expect it to work exactly like you think it's going to. These things are full of surprises. Bilstein, this part number has been around for a while. This is the most common 2-inch lift shock. I'm pretty sure that this is actually what 4x4 parts sells, except they don't provide the part number, so there's no way for me to prove that, other than to buy one from 4x4 parts and buy this part number and compare in person. I don't have $280 to do that, so I'll just tell you about this shock. 26 inches extended length, 16 inches collapsed. From what I can tell, people aren't adding extended bump stops to these. I know people who've had them and have not extended the bump stops, and they lasted the entire life of the time they're put on the vehicle. 10 inches of travel, not bad. 16 millimeter upper and lower mounts, which means one of those mounts you're going to have to modify whether you run the shock upside down or right side up. One of them, you're going to be able to put it on and it should fit almost exactly. And the other one, you're going to need a wider sleeve, a bigger bolt, or some other kind of fix, a different bushing that you could press in. You're going to need to modify that mount. Bilstein 33 1855 69. This is a newer part number in the sense that, from what I gathered, this used to only be put on SFD subframe dropped Pathfinders that were looking at running between 4 and 6 inches of lift in the rear. That has since changed since the introduction of Land Rover springs. I was the second person to put these on with Land Rover springs. I did it right after somebody else verified that it could be done. And I added, because I had to, I added extended center brake line. And I needed extended diff breather because it pops off at full flex. And then I also, because we're almost looking at 18 inches of collapse length of the shock, I added longer bump stops. Mine are about 2 inches longer. There's lots of different ways you can do it. I pulled mine off of a F250 that had these perfect looking bump stops, added a longer bolt. Body lift spacers are also a common one. It gets as cheap as adding 1 or 2 hockey pucks. But yeah, I extended the bump stops because I thought 18 inches was a big enough difference over these about 14 to 15 inch numbers that I didn't feel comfortable with it. Almost 30 inches long. And on my vehicle with 9449 springs, those are 14.8 inches long. Those 9449 springs, they almost can slip out, like the rubber isolator starts to peek out of the top, but I've never had them fall out, and I don't think they're going to start doing that. And that personal experience of mine is with the sway bar still connected on a 2003 Pathfinder. Okay, here we go. The only aftermarket direct bolt-on shock for R50 Pathfinders is this ARB OME N104. Now, they have it split. They have it correctly matched so that there's a facelift and a pre-facelift application, which should be directly bolt-on the correct side up. But I can only find one part number. Don't know why, but they do have a year selector. If you go on their website to order these shocks, they're more expensive than anything else, I think, but they do have a year selector, so this should be direct bolt-on, 25-inch extended, 15.4 collapse. This is a part number that I know fits an R50 Pathfinder. There's an NPOR member who has done it. This is the ProComp ES 326500. I looked up fitment, and apparently on ProComp shocks, if it ends in 00, that means it's a 5/8 inch rubber bushing on top and bottom 5/8 of an inch is 15.8 millimeters, which means it will squeeze onto or need drilling out onto the 16 millimeter mount, and then you will need to modify that 12 millimeter mount one way or another, because that's an upper and lower. So you'll see Bilsteins, these two part numbers, and these pro comps are all that 16 millimeters on both ends or 15.8 millimeters on both ends. This KYB could be mounted perfectly upside down or right side up, and then the OME will be direct bolt on. But 25 inches, it's hardly longer than stock. And unless you're running the OME springs, I don't think that's a super useful shock to have, because it's gonna limit your down travel, just is. If there's part numbers that you guys want to add to this discussion that you know for a fact work because they are on your R50 right now, please leave a comment. Let's see them. I can pull specs on those. We can talk. If you have questions about these shocks, I would be in no way surprised if I missed a detail, missed multiple details in this video. I talked a lot today, and shocks are actually a pretty complicated issue. I hope that video has demonstrated that to you. Even though that some of these are just as simple as different bolt, different bushing, that's ultimately a cheap fix, but it's not direct bolt on, and that makes it more complicated. If you have comments, please leave them. I hope this video is helpful. It was a difficult video to research and to decide how to approach the information without giving you guys a part number that just totally works without any modification. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys.